Dr. Oscar van Heerden is among several prominent Africans who have joined in the public call for President Cyril Ramaphosa to introduce a COVID-19 grant as an immediate measure to mitigate the devastation of our economy and to assist the vulnerable during COVID-19. He now joins me via Skype. Dr. van Heerden, thank you so much for joining us here this morning. Now, you've joined together with other academics and thought leaders, the 150-odd economists or 170-odd economists that have also called for a raft of economic measures to ameliorate hardship. Why do you think the state that is already having very little money in the state coffers can afford a COVID-19 grant or a basic income grant?
Thanks, Karima, and good morning to your viewers. I think that it is true that there are stress on the budget of the South African government, that indeed it is not going to be easy to find extra money for the kind of demand or plight that we are putting to the president. However, I do want to illustrate, Karima, that the government and the president in his State of the Nation address earlier this year did take a very bold decision to slice 1% of all government department budgets and put that into a kitty that will facilitate youth employment, because as you know, our unemployment levels are also extremely high in South Africa.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of bold measure that we saw the government and the president take. And I think that, in this case scenario, because of the devastation that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused, particularly amongst the bottom 6 million of our citizens who are vulnerable and poor and marginalized, I think such bold decisions must be made, and solutions must be found as to how we make money available to actually put cash in hand for those people. Now,
in your letter, you've spoken about the child support grant that is well established, and you say it's by far the biggest grant in terms of numbers, reaching about 12.8 million children, which you say is nearly 2/3 of all children in South Africa. Are you suggesting that we use that infrastructure to top it up, are you suggesting that that infrastructure needs to be used, or are you calling for a universal basic income grant that will be across the board?
Yeah, so what we've basically done is, because we know the complexity of such a decision, we've given the president and the cabinet options. We've said, look, there isn't a one-fit-all. Obviously, the core of the statement is for a COVID-19 special grant. And that can be the form of a basic income grant. In other words, we make sure that all South Africans get a grant of sorts. Obviously, for people like myself and you and the middle class and so forth, we won't even see that amount of money in terms of tax and so forth. But for the very vulnerable and the poor, it will go a long way. So we do make the proposal for a basic income grant, or we might call it a COVID-19 special grant. But we're also then saying that we understand that the very 6 million at the bottom that we are referring to are not necessarily documented in the sense of they have ID numbers, but we don't have them on any database or system. We don't know if they have bank accounts, if they have mobile phones and so forth. And that in itself can present a very big challenge for government. And so we also then make a proposal to say, if that is going to prove too difficult, and it will take time to actually get those individuals and those citizens onto a database, perhaps one other measure is to then say the existing infrastructure we have with regards to the child grants, can we top that up? Can we then put extra money into those accounts so that households in general have, by, for example, an additional 350, an additional 500, or an additional 700 rand, and that will again go very far in terms of those 12 plus million households that's on the child support grant. But it is an option. For us, the ideal would be that we begin to knuckle down and get those bottom 6 million onto a database, so that not only for this crisis, Karima, but all future crises where we feel that we want to put some money into the hands of the most vulnerable we actually then have a database.
Now, one of the things that you will obviously be asked is, where do you think government should get the money from? You've used the example of rerouting and reprioritizing funds to deal specifically with creating youth employment, because the rate of unemployment for young people is double that of general unemployment. Where will this money come from? We know that in the tripartite alliance, there is an aversion to going to the IMF and the World Bank because of the conditionalities. We have taken $1 billion from the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank. Where do you think this money is going to come from? And more importantly, how are we going to service this debt?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm also one of those that, as an individual, this is not a position of the group, but as an individual, I'm also opposed to going to the IMF and the World Bank, because not only because of conditionalities, but because of their track record in terms of Africa. So that aside, I mean, I think that we do feel, as a concerned Africans, we do feel that there is sufficient amount of money inside the country. We have various pots of money, whether it is indeed money in the PIC, whether it's money with the IDC, whether it's money with the unemployment fund, etc. There is a large amount of pots of money where we can reprioritize. Because the thing here, Karima, is that we mustn't look at it as if it's a permanent solution, and that we would have to permanently sustain this thing. We are saying that we are in a particular crisis. We have introduced lockdown measures. People that used to hustle to actually make ends meet, go and do fishing on our beaches, or go and beg on the street corners, push trolleys at the supermarkets. None of these activities can happen now because of the lockdown regulations. And so people are feeling the pinch. People that ordinarily would not necessarily rely on government and try and hustle to get something on the table for themselves and for their families are now unable to do that. And so we are saying in this period of a few months, you know, if we talk of the peak of this virus in South Africa possibly hitting in September, then we are saying over a 6 to 8 month period, what is it that we can do in the interim to alleviate the absolute desperate situation of the poorest of the poor.
Now, we've seen some newspaper headlines this weekend talking about mass hunger. And of course, many of our journalists and community activists have warned about this. People are hungry. They're not able to go out there and hustle, whether it's for 20 Rand or 50 Rand to just get through the day. What about issues around food drops, organized food drops? I've had conversations with many people in government on the economic packages that are being discussed in preparation for tomorrow's cabinet meeting. One of the concerns that they have is that the current food parcel situation is being abused, even though people don't want to say it on the record. We've seen some people being, found out that they are directing food parcels for political gain, for personal, private gain. And are you considering that food parcels and food drops could also be a measure to help stave off things like hunger, especially if you don't have a database of people that are in any event not captured on any kind of system?
Karima, we are very, very encouraged to see, and I think all South Africans can take great pride in how our community and how our community activists have rallied around this issue in terms of providing the very basic in terms of food provision. However, you are right. We are also very aware of the political influences that plays its part. ANC people only giving ANC supporters food, DA people only giving DA, and so on and so forth. And that is obviously, we need to discourage that because we are all in this crisis together. But I do want to say that we do feel very strongly about the fact that even though we see these food parcels ranging between 550 Rand to 750 Rand, I do still argue that, and we feel strongly, that if you put that 750 into the hands of citizens, it can actually go much further than the food parcels that we are providing. I mean, we obviously know the most basic is that we need to deal with hunger, and we are encouraged by Cabinet and by the President making 400 million Rand available. Gift of the givers are playing a huge role, but we are literally, Karima, if we look at the numbers, we are literally looking at about, at the most, an impact of about 700,000-800,000 which families. Now, of course, that is 800,000 that didn't have food, but the number of people that are desperate and poor far, far outweighs that 800,000 that is able to access those food parcels. And we think that if we can put money into people's hands, they will actually make that money go much further.
Now, one of the things that people continuously talk about is corruption, both in terms of the grant system as well as the food parcels. We're coming out of an era of state capture. There is a lot of indications that our systems are vulnerable to corruption. How do you propose the president deals with this, considering the fact that, corruption was upscaled on an industrial scale, in a sense, during the state capture years? Is this just not another instance where things can go horribly wrong?
Well, I mean, we absolutely, we need to be guarded against that because, as you know, it's not just so much state capture and the period we come out of, but it's also a culture that has set in where people feel that they can make a quick buck. And it's not only government, it's people in the private sector, it's entrepreneurs and so forth and so on, because at the end of the day, what President Ramaphosa needs to try and do, not only in this crisis, but even post the crisis, is to try and undo that particular cultural practice, that sense of, I can get away with it. And so I think that law enforcement agencies, besides being on the streets and trying to enforce the regulations around lockdown, also need to be very aware of individuals and or groupings that want to exploit the situation and actually indulge in corrupt practices, the NPA and so forth. We know, for example, there were question marks around a particular tender that was released by the Gauteng provincial government. And I think citizens, the one thing that we are encouraged, Karima, is, as you know, over the period of the Zuma administration, over the period of state capture, the role that NGOs, the civil society, and individual people played to actually whistleblow, to actually expose and highlight. I think that kind of action from our people need to continue. If they see that there's something amiss, as they did in Mitchell's Plain in the Western Cape, that people phoned in, they left their details, and yet not sufficient amount of food parcels arrived and so forth. I can, for example, tell you, for the viewers that don't know, in terms of the school feeding scheme, even at that level, small micro enterprises that have gotten the tenders to provide food and nutrition to our people, to our school children, also take shortcuts. You know, you go to those feeding schemes and you find that the regulation from the department, basic education department, says there needs to be some protein, meaning some meat in the food. They simply don't put it in. They take that money, they put it in their pocket. And so only starch is what is provided and so forth. So corruption comes at all levels. And I think that government needs to make sure that there are parallel processes in terms of law enforcement and, of course, our citizens keeping a watchful eye to make sure that we avoid those kinds of practices.
All right, that's where we will leave it. Thank you so much to Dr. Oscar van Heerden, part of that group of people campaigning for a COVID-19 special grant. Up next, claims of human rights violations at Cape Town's camp for the homeless during this pandemic. We take a look at the allegations on the other side of this.